Today we are not talking about Chappell Roan. The Giver is the title of a Chappell Roan song, but it is also the title of a very popular young adult novel. So popular, in fact, that many kids are forced to read it in school. Myself included. When I was a youngin', I was forced to read this. And typically I hated the books I was forced to read for school because I hate being told what to do. Which does make learning that I have a Patreon where the Patreon picks the book that I make a video for every month very interesting. But I have faith in you guys. I know you're gonna pick good choices, and so far so good. This is the first month and we're doing Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, so if that's something you find interesting, I'll link the Patreon in the description below. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about The Giver, young adult novel, not Chappell Roan song. On this channel, we are very much on a young adult dystopians from my childhood kick. We talked about The Hunger Games, we've talked about Divergent, and there's a bunch of suggestions as to what series I should do next. But I've been wanting to do The Giver for a while, and I haven't really had a great opportunity. And so I figured while we were in this lull in between series, I could take the opportunity to do a one-off video on The Giver. I am intending for it to be a one-off right now. There are technically other books in the Giver series, but it's not a chronological series. Part of the fun of the book series as a whole is that not everything is explicitly explained and some things are left ambiguous. So where this book leaves off at the end, there are hintings of what happens to the characters, but they're just hintings, and the other books in the series are about completely different things. So as of right now, I'm planning for this to be a one-off on The Giver, but if you guys are super interested in me making videos on the other books in the Giver series, let me know down below and I totally will. But anyway, going back to Young Mare and not liking to be forced to read things, this is one of the only books I remember reading for school that I actually really enjoyed. And I really enjoyed the movie adaptation that came out when I was 16. I saw it in theaters actually with my family. So I thought, why not revisit it as an adult? See if I still enjoy it, see if I still feel the same way about it. I feel a responsibility to say before we dive headfirst into the analysis of this is that if you are a child watching this video instead of reading the book for your school project, I don't approve. I don't approve, but I will be avoiding cursing on your behalf. Real quick establishment, I watched the movie adaptation as well, and we will talk about it at the end of the video, but there are differences between the book and the movie, and specifically, the movie explicitly explains a lot of things that the book doesn't. So if I say, oh, they don't really explain that, and you remember it having been explained, you might be remembering the movie, not the book. So with all of that, let's talk about the exposition, let's talk about the world building, let's talk about the society that we're living in. This book takes place in a community, is what they're called. However, that's not even explained to our main character Jonas until well into the book. From the perspective of all of the people that live within this society, the society has just kind of always existed. Things just are this way, and there's no explanation as to why, really. Everybody lives in what they call communities, and the communities are governed by very strict rules. New children are born from birth mothers. They're not all born on the same day, but in December of every year, they are all just called one. So everybody is considered to have the same birthday, even though they are not actually all born on the same day. And they all just become a year older in December. When they turn 1 in December, they're all given a name, then they are assigned to a family. The families then raise those children, and the ages are counted up until 12, and every new age brings about new responsibility and also new rules. And eventually, when all of the children turn 12, they are assigned their job. This is assigned to them by the elders. They watch them through their whole childhood and try and figure out what the best job for them would be. Then everybody begins training for their jobs, and eventually they grow old enough to go into their own dwelling away from their parents. I am not sure if they ever spend time in their own dwelling away from their parents, not in a pair. I don't know that that's ever broken down, but eventually they are put into a pair again by the elders. These pairs are selected, and then you can apply to have children if you want, and then you would be assigned a new child if it was approved. There's a maximum of 1 boy and 1 girl to each couple, pair, whatever you want to call them. And then once those children grow old enough to leave the dwelling of their parents. The parents then move into adults without children, or like child-free, I don't know, it's like for a community for the adults that don't have children, basically. And then eventually when you grow too old to do your job anymore, you move into the house of old. And then eventually after that, you are released to elsewhere. They don't just release the old people to elsewhere, they also release one of each pair of twins that are born, and any new children that just aren't strong enough to be assigned to a family when they're supposed to turn 1. And also anybody who has severe disciplinary problems or isn't really following the rules. If they're disrupting the community too much, then they can also be released to elsewhere, though that is considered a pretty extreme action. So that's the society, and that's how everybody is living. Now you might be wondering, how do they get everybody to go along with this? What if people don't like their job? What if people don't like their pairing? What if people don't like their children? What if people want to have their own children? Yada, yada, yada. Well, it's all kind of framed out as like the elders know best. So the elders watch everybody. They know everybody inside and out. They watch everything that happens in the community, and they typically choose really good jobs for everybody. Rarely is there a circumstance where somebody gets assigned a job and they don't really like it. And we see this in action with one of Jonas's friends that he's kind of worried about, where he has really struggled to take anything seriously over the course of their childhood, and Jonas is really concerned that the elders aren't going to be able to figure out a good job for him. And then in the book, that friend, Asher, ends up being assigned to be the assistant director of recreation. So it's essentially his job to make sure that all of the children have safe fun. So we're shown this as an example of the elders observing somebody, seeing their strengths, seeing what they're good at, and knowing exactly what to assign them to be a job that they're going to be happy doing. The elders in this community, the leaders essentially, are not framed out to be the bad guys at the beginning of the book. Jonas is our main character. He's about to turn 12, which means he's about to be assigned his job, and he's got really no issues with the community the way that it is. He's not even aware of the fact that it could be any other way. Everybody likes the elders. Nobody really has a problem with the society the way that it is. Early in the book, Jonas has a dream about a female classmate of his named Fiona, where they're standing beside a bathtub and he's trying to get her to get into the bathtub, and they both know that she shouldn't, but he really, really wants her to, and he can't really understand why he wants her to so badly. Everybody in the family unit is required to share any dreams that they had at the breakfast table. So when Jonas tells his parents about this dream, his mom informs him that this is called the stirrings, and it means that he's ready for his medication. So then he would start taking a daily pill that he would then take for the rest of his life. Now, this is a difference between the book and the movie. It's never explicitly stated in the book what this medication is for. However, having the perspective that we have on the world and the knowledge that we have about these things, we know what this dream is. We know what the stirrings mean, and we know that the pills stop them from happening. So at the very least, we know that they suppress sexual urges, but it is implied over the course of the book, just implied, again, this is different from the movie, it is implied over the course of the book that the pills also suppress extreme emotion, and so this is part of how they keep the society in line. Everybody's extreme emotions are suppressed, and you're essentially only able to feel fleeting feelings instead of really deep emotions. So think happiness instead of joy, disappointment instead of sadness. Like, people can feel these sort of fleeting things, but they can't really feel the depth of them. And this is emphasized by the fact that there's a lot of emphasis in the society put on precision of language. At one point, Jonas has a memory of a time that he said he was starving, and he was reprimanded for saying this and saying no one in the community is starving. Nobody's ever starving. We have enough food for everybody. You are just hungry. There's a difference between hunger and starvation. Like, you can feel happiness in a moment, but joy is a completely different, like, much deeper thing. I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense, but it's implied that the pills suppress all of those deeper emotions. And so that's part of how they keep everybody in line and keep everybody following the rules. We will come back to the pills eventually once we talk about the whole plot. So with that, we're gonna go over the plot, but honestly, this is gonna be the quickest part of the video. This is not a super plot heavy book. There's a lot more emphasis on just doing the world building and then conversations between Jonas and his eventual mentor, and then a little bit of action that happens at the end. But essentially what happens is the first 100-ish pages are establishing this whole society in this world, and then they have their ceremony where all of the 12s are going to be assigned their new jobs, and Jonas is assigned to become the receiver of memory. The receiver of memory is considered to be the most important elder, but nobody really understands what he does, and he's considered to be a recluse. All anybody knows about him is that he advises the council when they make really important decisions. The chief elder gives Jonas a whole speech about the importance of what he's going to do and the bravery he's going to need and the pain he's going to experience going on this journey, and that he has all of the qualities of somebody to become the receiver of memory, and specifically that he has what they call the capacity to see beyond, which is something that none of really the rest of them can conceptualize, and neither can Jonas in this very moment. He gets his rules for his training, which involve some things that really throw him. The two rules that he sees that really give him pause are that he can't ask to be released to elsewhere, and that he can lie. And he's exempt from rudeness rules, so he can ask anybody anything and he won't be considered rude. These rules really throw him. He doesn't know what to do with that. He's lived by all these other rules his whole life, so having these new rules is really strange for him. But he shows up to his first day and he meets the current receiver of memory, who he starts to call the giver, because he is giving him memories. Memories of what, you might ask? Memories of the past, memories of a world before the communities existed, memories of what life was like for humanity before they formed this society. Why would that be so important, you might ask? Well, Jonas has the same questions. Why do we have these memories? What do you mean of the past? What do you mean of a time before the communities? The communities have been around forever. No, they haven't. They were formed at some point by people. So this is sort of when we find out that this is actually a post-apocalyptic sort of society, and the human beings of that time thought that what they call sameness would be a better, more peaceful society, and they formed this society around that, and they've been living in this society ever since. But because there has been this push to sameness, there essentially is nobody in the community who knows anything outside of everything that they've experienced in their lives. And so the receiver of memory is supposed to be the person who has knowledge of what the world was like beforehand, so that if some kind of decision needs to be made and the people on the council do not have the context or understanding in order to make that decision, they can consult the receiver of memory and the receiver will advise. The giver starts out by giving Jonas a bunch of positive memories. Jonas learns of color. They don't have color in their society, we find out. He learns of people of other races. They don't have anybody with different skin tones in their society. He learns of weather. They don't have weather in their society. So partially through the giver giving him these memories, we, the reader, are finding out what is abnormal for them to have. This is a really smart delivery method for some of these things. One of the most difficult things about writing some kind of fantasy, or just something that takes place on a different world or in a different context than the one we live in, is that your characters aren't going to notice something that's normal to them. So if Jonas doesn't know what rain or snow is, he's not going to look around and think, we never have rain, we never have snow, because he doesn't know what these things are. So how would he know that their society doesn't have them? So by watching Jonas go through these experiences where he learns about color and he learns about weather and he learns about hills and mountains and the ocean and deserts, by learning about all of these things, he learns that their society doesn't have them, but this also establishes for the reader that this society doesn't have them. It's a very smart exposition sort of delivery method. The first memory that the giver gives him is of somebody riding down a hill on a sled. So he learns about snow, he learns about sledding, he learns about hills, all through just this one memory. And with this memory and many others, he says to the giver, why don't we have this stuff? This stuff is so amazing. Why don't we have any of this? I don't understand. The giver at first is really determined to only give him happy and joyful memories, but eventually clues him into the fact that these things were not exclusively good things. And he shows Jonas this by showing him another sledding memory, where this time, instead of the sledding memory being very positive and being very fun and the person enjoying the experience, the person gets thrown off the sled, breaks their leg, and then is stuck alone in the snow and there's nobody around to help them. So he experiences severe physical pain, but he also experiences the loneliness and fear of somebody who is hurt out in the cold with nobody around to help them, who can't move. The giver then goes on to tell him, so you see how these things aren't exclusively good things, and sometimes these things that seem so good can lead to bad. So as Jonas is exposed to all of these things that he thinks are so positive and or harmless, the giver is slowly also exposing him to the fact that some of these things can lead to bad things. And so that's why they don't have them in the society anymore. And eventually the giver tells him a story of a time that the community has come to him for advice because Jonas wants to know what that looks like. And he explains that at some point people had petitioned the council to say, hey, why don't we have more babies? If we had more babies, we'd have more hands for laborers, we'd have more brains for engineering. It seems like a big positive. The council was like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But they think, you know what, this is a unique problem. Why don't we go ask the giver what he thinks? Although they call him the receiver of memory because that's his official position title. We just call him the giver to differentiate him from Jonas because it would get confusing if they were both called the receiver of memory over the course of the book. Anyway, they consult the giver and the giver tells them, no, you shouldn't do it. And what he tells Jonas is that he told them that because he remembers starvation. So remember earlier when we talked about the difference between hunger and starvation, he remembers a time when people experienced severe hunger, when they experienced starvation, and he knows that lack of resources can lead to that starvation. So while it seems on the surface exclusively a positive to have more people in the society, more people means more food, more housing, more everything. And if we don't have enough resources for everybody, that can lead to starvation. So then Jonas says, well, did you explain all of this to them? And the giver says, no, I didn't, because they don't have the concept to understand everything that I'm telling you. All I told them was that I didn't think it was a good idea for them to do it, and they listened to me. Jonas himself has experiences where he starts to try and expose his friends and his family to certain things that he's experiencing, and nobody around him is really able to conceptualize anything that he's saying or doing, and they can't understand what's going on with him. And eventually he asks his parents if they love him, and his parents get very confused and they say to him, precision of language. And when his younger sister Lily is very confused by the word, his mom says, Jonas just used a word that's so antiquated it doesn't have a purpose anymore. And then they tell him, if you're asking us if we enjoy you, the answer is of course yes. And if you're asking us if we take pride in your accomplishments, then the answer is yes. Does that answer your question? And Jonas says yes. And while the parents think that that means that he understands that they feel those things for him and that that counts as love essentially, or that like love is an antiquated word and it doesn't have a specific meaning, Jonas understands that that means that they don't love him, that they can't love him, they can't even conceptualize love. Something that's been going on in the background that I haven't really mentioned up to now is that Jonas's dad is what they call a nurturer. And so he takes care of the new children. And there is a new child who was kind of struggling to sleep at night and they weren't sure if they were ready to be assigned a family, and so he was taking them home at night because apparently the night shift of nurturers isn't as great as the day shift, at least that's what he says. And so he starts bringing the baby home at night for them to take care of him, and he had peeked at his name ahead of time and knows that his name is Gabriel, even though none of the new children are supposed to have names until they're assigned families. And he's not quite ready for the ceremony when it comes around, but they get an exception to give him another year, and he's living for another year with Jonas's family unit to see if he'll be ready to join the following ones, because I don't like releasing people to elsewhere. At some point the conversation comes up between Jonas and the giver about the fact that there had been a receiver of memory that had failed 10 years prior. This has been mentioned in passing throughout the book, but when the giver and Jonas have the conversation about it, the giver tells him that there was a girl named Rosemary who was assigned the receiver of memory position, but when he gave her the first really, really bad memory, the memory of suffering, the memory that he gave her was that of a child who had been taken away from their mother. And according to the giver, this took all the light out of her eyes, and the following day she went to the council and asked to be released, and he never saw her again. So that's why they put the rule into Jonas's list of rules that he was not allowed to be asked to be released to elsewhere. He's not allowed to do this. And then they do it differently in the book versus the movie. But in the book, Jonas starts talking to the giver about how his dad said that twins were born and that they were going to pick the heavier one to keep them and release the other one to elsewhere. And Jonas starts asking the giver questions about where elsewhere is and where people get released to and what all of that means. And so the giver just plays him the video of the release that happened that morning of the twin. And that's when Jonas finds out that releasing somebody to elsewhere means killing them. So he watches as his own father injects this infant with a serum that kills it and then puts it into a box and essentially puts it down a trash chute. And Jonas is horrified, obviously, by this. Jonas. But the giver is really trying to comfort him, saying they don't understand what they're doing. And he's like, how could he not understand what he's doing? He injected the baby with something that made it just completely stop moving. Like, he watched the life go out of the baby. How could he not understand that he's taking the life from that baby? And the giver is trying to explain to him they don't even understand what like life means. They don't have any deep emotion. They can't conceptualize any of this. They don't know what you know. They don't understand what you understand. He has no idea what he's doing. So this is the point where Jonas is like, this is awful. We have not created a better society. We have just created a society that kills people in different ways, and people aren't experiencing the full extent of life. Yes, maybe they're not experiencing suffering, but they're also not experiencing joy. They're not experiencing love. They're not experiencing the full extent of what life has to offer. And the giver is like, I totally agree with you, dude. I've had that thought in the past. I've wanted to do something about it, but I've never known what to do about it. So they hatched this whole plan because when Rosemary, the previous receiver of memory, passed away, her memories that she had at that point from the giver were released back to the community, and all of the emotions that she had been exposed to also got released to everybody. And so the giver has this theory that if Jonas were to leave the community, even if he were not to perish, that meant that his memories would be released back to everybody in the community. And so they hatched this whole plan for Jonas to leave the community. He's gonna get away scot-free. Nobody's even gonna notice he's gone. For a few days, it'll be great. Remember, the baby who's staying with his family had been sleeping very well at night because Jonas had been feeding him memories, because it turns out that the baby also has the capacity to see beyond. And so he's been feeding Gabriel happy memories at night to help Gabriel sleep. While Jonas was with the giver, he decides to spend the night at the giver's place because he's so upset about finding out that his dad has murdered this other infant, essentially. So they had told his family that he was going to do overnight training at the giver's place. And so his dad takes the opportunity to take Gabriel back to the nurturing center to see how he sleeps at the nurturing center, to see if he's ready to be assigned to a family. And he fussed the whole night. He could not sleep through the night. He totally frazzled the night shift. And they ended up deciding, you know what? We don't think this infant is going to make it in our society. He's too fussy. And so they decide to release him to elsewhere. And when Jonas finds this out, he decides, you know what? They've left me no choice. I have to escape, and I have to take Gabriel with me because they're going to kill him. And he loves Gabriel now. So he steals Gabriel and he runs off in the middle of the night and he escapes. And over the course of the few days as he's escaping, planes are flying overhead trying to find him, but none of them are able to hunt him down. He's able to hide from them. And he feels the memories fading away, and it's implied and presumed that the memories were returned back to the community and that the giver is guiding everybody through the emotions that they're feeling. Oh, I forgot to mention that the giver decided to stay behind, both to help the community through all of the confusion of experiencing these emotions the way that he did with Jonas, but also because he says he'd like to be with his daughter when it's all said and done. And when Jonas asks who his daughter is, he said her name was Rosemary. So it's revealed to us that Rosemary, the previous receiver of memory, was the giver's daughter. So all of that to say that at the end of their journey, Jonas is exhausted, Gabriel's exhausted, they don't have any food, and he's hiking up this snowy hill and he doesn't know what they're gonna do, and he's freezing and they don't have any food, and he's hardening him and Gabriel with the last remaining memories that he has of warmth and joy as they're making their last little hike. And then he stumbles upon a sled, and then he sleds down the hill, and at the bottom of the hill there is a house where he can hear music and laughter and joy, and he understands in that moment that they have made it home. And that's the end of the book. Now, I cried my way through a lot of this reread. It was very heartfelt. It was very touching, but also very fascinating to me. I want to take you guys on the journey that I went on of my interpretation of the message of this book, because I find it incredibly interesting given what my eventual thoughts are on my analysis. So when I was a child, what I remember thinking this book was about is the highs and lows of life, and the fact that you can't have the good without the bad. That whole idea of it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, and that we can't have all of these positive emotions that we value so much without having the risk of negative emotion. For example, grief comes from the loss of something that you love. So you can't have grief if you don't have love. So in order to not have grief, what you really need to take away from people is love, because if you love something, then there is always the risk that you lose it, and that is what leads to that grief. So this is what I remember the overarching message of this book being, is just this concept and the fact that you can't have the good without the bad. And upon my reread, I do feel like that is the overarching message of this book still. However, what I see in it now that I did not see in it when I myself was in middle school reading it is this story as a coming of age story. I had thought of this book as a young adult dystopian to the degree where it came to mind in my potentially doing videos on young adult dystopians, right? This isn't really a dystopian. This book has nothing to do with the society itself. It's not about the society at all. This book is about Jonas and his emotional journey. Jonas is 12 years old and is presumably starting puberty. That's what the pills are there to suppress. When you take a step back and you look at this book as an adult, you notice that the community is sort of representative of eternal childhood. Children who grow up in safe households have a very small world. The world is just surrounding them and their experiences, and they have rules that they follow, and when they follow the rules, things are good, and when they don't follow the rules, things are bad, and they don't really understand why the rules are there all the time. When you're a young child, you think of your parents as these omnipotent beings and the rules that they create as just the rules of the world and the rules of life, and you don't give a whole lot of thought as to where they come from or whether or not you agree with them. And if you don't want to follow them, then you might try and break them, but then you find out what the consequences of breaking the rules are. So there's a bunch of clear-cut rules, and if you follow the rules, life is good, and if you don't follow the rules, life isn't good. Everything's laid out for you, your path is laid out for you, and you're just making your way through your life, skipping around. And then eventually, we start to grow up and our world gets bigger and we start to see what's happening, not just with the people immediately around us, but with people we don't even know and what's going on in the broader world. We start to understand that a lot of the rules that we thought were just there were actually created by our parents or the people that run our schools or whatever it might be. And we start to be able to feel a lot of these more complicated emotions. Now, I don't at all mean to imply that I don't think children are capable of strong emotion, because of course they are. Children are capable of experiencing very strong emotion, and even though their worlds are really small, like, I don't say any of this to disrespect children. This just is the reality of being a small child. You would almost want this, right? We want all children to grow up in safe households. We want them to grow up in safe environments. We want them to grow up in a world where they don't have to confront some of these more complicated things. But eventually, we all must leave that world. We all must leave childhood and enter a world that doesn't have clear-cut rules, that doesn't have a clear-cut path, where every decision we make has a trade-off. Instead of there being a really clear-cut right answer and really clear-cut wrong answer to a lot of things, everything's complicated. Something might have some good aspects of it and some bad aspects of it. And you have to make those decisions not just for yourself, but eventually if you have your own children, you'll also be making those trade-off decisions for them, and they'll be impacted by the decisions you're making. And this is a very scary transition. This essentially is the transition from childhood to adulthood. And it's like a decade-long journey. I would say we're all on that journey from like 12 to 22 or 23 at least. So you see what I mean about how this book isn't really a true dystopian, because I think of a dystopian as a book that takes something about our world that is bad and turns it up to 11 to really show what's bad about it, and then writes a book about that to make commentary on society. This book has no commentary on society, and the way that the community is designed isn't taking something that exists in our world and turning it up to 11. So it's not really making any commentary about the world that we live in now necessarily. Instead, in my opinion, the community and everybody within it are supposed to be children. And Jonas, when he turns 12 and is assigned this role as the receiver of memory, Jonas is given this whole speech that I'm just going to read you from the chief elder when he's assigned the receiver of memory position. Jonas, the training required of you involves pain, physical pain. You have never experienced that. Yes, you have scraped your knees and falls from your bicycle. Yes, you have crushed your finger in a door last year, but you will be faced now with the pain of a magnitude that none of us here can comprehend because it is beyond our experience. The receiver himself was not able to describe it, only to remind us that you would be faced with it, that you would need immense courage. We cannot prepare you for that, but we feel certain that you are brave. The fourth essential attribute is wisdom. Jonas has not yet acquired that. The acquisition of wisdom will come through his training. We are convinced that Jonas has the ability to acquire wisdom. That is what we looked for. Finally, the receiver must have one more quality, and it is one which I can only name but not describe. I do not understand it. You members of the community will not understand it either. Perhaps Jonas will, because the current receiver has told us that Jonas already has this quality. He calls it the capacity to see beyond. Jonas, you'll be trained to be our next receiver of memory. We thank you for your childhood. So with all of that, my perspective on the book now and the intention of it and sort of what's supposed to come across is that the community are supposed to represent children, and life in the community is supposed to be representative of life as a childhood. The rules are really clear cut, the path is laid out for you, everything is answered for you, and you never have to face complicated emotion. But the trade-off of that is that you don't have any choice, and you're limited in your ability to experience extreme emotion and the full range of what you can experience as an adult human, of what it means to be a human and what it means to be alive. Jonas then turns 12 and is assigned the receiver of memory position, and then he goes on to have an overt training experience with the giver that I think is supposed to be representative of the emotional journey that all of us go on from childhood to adulthood, understanding that we are leaving the world of clear-cut rules and entering a gray area where there is no right or wrong answer to most questions and everything is a trade-off. And this idea of you can't have the good without the bad, and that it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, and all of this is the giver trying to help Jonas learn to cope with the uncertainty of the world that he is starting to live in and understand the depth of the importance of the decisions he's going to end up making and the impact that they might have, but also to help him gain the wisdom to be able to make those decisions, because that really is what that journey is, and that's what our teen years really are about. And then at the end of the book, we see how Jonas uses that wisdom and that training to escape with Gabriel and to make choices not just for himself, but for Gabriel that have trade-offs and that put him into this gray area where he's unsure if he made the right decision. And through a lot of that, he's really worried, especially when they start to become hungry, he starts thinking to himself, was leaving the right thing to do? Because yes, I've returned all these memories to everybody, but now that he is starving, he's starting to wonder if it really was better that way or not. He's not sure he made the right choice, but eventually he makes it to where he is going. And so again, I don't think this book is necessarily a dystopian. I don't think it exists to make commentary on our society. I think it exists to help children of a middle school sort of start to conceptualize some of these things and to help them cope with it and to help give them comfort as they enter onto this journey into adulthood. And so that's why I think it's so interesting that when I read it as a child, I seem to have taken away the message I was supposed to have taken away from it. I thought it was just about the fact that you can't have the good without the bad, and there are trade-offs in life, but you wouldn't give the good experiences away just to avoid experiencing those bad things, because then we take away what it means to be human and we take away what it means to be alive. But I fully missed this story as a coming-of-age story because I was coming of age. So when I read Jonas's journey, I just identified with it because I was at the age where I would identify with it. But now that I don't identify with it anymore because I'm 26, and I have the perspective to understand the difference between childhood and adulthood, I read this book and I was like, oh, this is a coming of age story. And so I just thought that was really interesting. There's a few other things I want to call out that support what I'm saying that I think are really fascinating, specifically to do with the sledding. We see the giver give him this first really good sledding memory where everything goes really well. And then we see the giver give him a bad sledding memory where things don't go well. However, there is a difference between these two memories. These memories are not one and the same and they don't start the same. When he enters the memory of the good sledding time, one of the things that is remarked is that the snow is really fluffy. And as he's sledding down the hill, the riders that under the sled, I think they're called riders or runners, whatever they're called, whatever the actual things under the sled are called, how they cut through the snow super easily and they cut him this path that he's riding down the hill. Whereas the second sledding memory, it's immediately noted how icy the snow is and how packed in it is. And anybody who knows anything about sledding will tell you that's not good snow for sledding or skiing. That's dangerous. You don't want to sled or ski on ice. I don't live in a place where it snows, and even I know that. So we see how Jonas is given these two memories, and one of them goes well and one of them doesn't, but there is information in the memory which will tell him which it is. And obviously it's not a guarantee. You could still have an accident on a day that's good for sledding, and you could still sled perfectly fine on a day that isn't good for sledding. However, you're more likely to get injured if you sled on a day that isn't good for sledding. And if you think about it from the perspective of a child, a young child, like a 5-year-old, might see that it's snowing outside and be like, oh my God, we should go sledding. But their parent might go outside and say, this is not good snow for sledding. The kid's not going to get that. To the child, the snow is snow. And the adult in that situation most likely will and should try to teach the 5-year-old about it and try to show them the snow and say, no, do you see, even though it's snow, it's not a safe day for sledding. And if we sled today, we might get injured. This child probably isn't going to be able to understand that. And in fact, it probably will deeply upset them that they're not going to be allowed to sled. But they will not be allowed to sled. And if they try to sled anyway, they are yay big and it's pretty easy to stop them. But over time, as the child ages, as they get older, they will start to be able to understand what the parent was trying to teach them. And they will eventually go on the same journey that Jonas is going on to get to the point where they can make all of these decisions for themselves. We see specifically what I just described in action between the giver and the council when the giver is telling Jonas the story of the advice that he gave the council a few years back, where he explains that from the council's perspective, of course it would only be a positive to have more children, but the giver understands what the potential trade-offs of that are because he understands these concepts that the council does not understand. He understands hunger, he understands starvation, he understands suffering in a way that they don't, and he understands that the decision that they're trying to make here potentially is going to lead to that hunger and that starvation and that suffering, and so he stops them from doing it. But in this story, he doesn't even try to tell them why, because he tells Jonas they can't understand it. They don't have the ability to conceptualize anything that I'm explaining to you because they don't have anything like that in their world and in their experiences. So do you see what I'm saying? Do you see what I mean about the community being children? And in this instance specifically, the giver is the parent. So all of that to say that I thought this book was incredibly beautiful. I think it's wonderful. I think it's stunning. I think it's a masterpiece. It's one of my favorite books of all time now. I always held it in very high regard in my memory, but I hold it in even higher a regard now. And I honestly choked up a lot reading it, thinking of middle schoolers reading it and being caught up in the storm of this emotion and how scary all of it is and how awful all of it really is and how hard it is to start that journey into adulthood and how scary it is. And I love that this book exists to help children through that journey and to help them start to conceptualize some of this stuff. You know, we've all had the moment where we're like, God, I wish I was still a child. Do you remember those days? Do you remember how simple it was? Do you remember how easy everything was? And while all of that is true, and I don't think it was the intention of this book necessarily to send this message, I think reading it as an adult, I got sort of this message of, would you really want to still be a child? Would you really still want to live in that world? Because yes, everything is easy, everything is simple, everything's clear cut, and your journey is really defined for you, but you don't get to choose any piece of it, and you don't get to experience that really deep emotion that comes with understanding and conceptualizing a lot of this stuff. And so I do still think that the message on some level is how beautiful it is to be alive and how lucky we are to be able to experience the full range of human emotion, even if that means that sometimes we experience incredibly negative emotions. That it's still beautiful to be alive and it's beautiful to be able to experience these things. But I see it now as more of a guide into experiencing that and feeling that and attempting to make that less scary for somebody who is starting that journey, and it just made me cry. If you are a middle schooler who is watching this to cheat on your homework, I am still disappointed in you, but I also love you, and I want you to know it's gonna be okay. And then I think you should read the book anyway, even if you've got like too short an amount of time to do it before you turn in your assignment. I still think you should read it, because I actually think you would benefit a lot from it. But with all of that, I also decided to rewatch the movie adaptation. I remember feeling very positively towards the movie adaptation. I watched it when I was 16 and I really enjoyed it. I had no complaints about it at the time. I remember that some people did though, and I remember feeling at the time like they were kind of silly. I remember people being mad that they added a love interest, that they added a motorcycle chase, and that they changed some things from the book. They made everything a little bit more clear cut, they explained things a little bit more in depth, not as much as left up to interpretation or ambiguity. And I just remember thinking all of that was kind of silly because those are often changes that they make to make a movie adaptation, because a movie is just a different medium from a book. And I was sort of in the infancy urgency at that time of my opinion that as long as a film got across the message and the feel of a book and that the characters felt the same, then that the film did its job. And it's a different medium, and sometimes they're gonna have to change things, and that's okay. And that's still my opinion to this day. However, interestingly enough, now that I've watched the film again as an adult after rereading the book, I agree with a lot of the criticisms, but not the addition of a love interest or a motorcycle chase, because I still don't really care about that kind of stuff. In the movie, Jonas and Fiona, the fellow student of his that he was a little bit hot for in his dream, they have more of a full, like, romantic sort of journey in the film. I didn't really think that was that big a deviation from the book, because he is hot for her in the book. And not just the one time. He stops taking his medication eventually, you know? So it kind of felt like they just dove deeper into that. And the fact that he actually does more of like a chase to get out of the community instead of it being him sneaking out into the middle of the night, I mean, who cares? They're just putting more action on screen. So I still don't really care about those things. However, the really big thing that they changed that I didn't like is that they made Jonas older. So Jonas and Fiona and Asher, his friend, are all 16 in the film as opposed to being 12 in the book. Now, Hollywood does this for layers of reasons. The biggest just being that working with child actors is a lot more complicated than working with adults, and there's a lot more rules you have to follow in order to protect the children. And of course, those rules should be there. I agree with those rules being there. However, the rules being there often lead to Hollywood making the decision when they adapt young adult books into movies to raise the age of the children in the book so that they can cast a full adult to play the child. Because they do that all the time, right? They cast adults to play teenagers almost exclusively. They pretty much never cast teenagers to play teenagers. So the actor who played Jonas was, I believe, like 23 or 24 when they filmed the movie, and he's playing a 16-year-old. I imagine that the core of this decision is just to get around those laws, like I said, and to not have to account for having child actors on set. Well, they did have some child actors, but just not to have literally every scene that they're filming have a child actor, so they have to follow those rules for every single scene. But also, I could totally see it where a lot of what Jonas has to conquer and a lot of what he's going through, they might have thought was a lot to put on screen with an actual 12-year-old, and making him 16 will make it an easier watch. But that's the part of it that I don't agree with. They completely removed the aspect of this book that is the coming of age story. It's not a coming of age story anymore because he has already, in a way, come of age. Like, yes, he is not an adult, 16 is not an adult, but 16 is already well into this emotional journey that I am talking about. A 12-year-old is starting their journey into adolescence. A 16-year-old is fully an adolescent at that point, and they are on the verge of becoming more of like a young adult. And these are very distinct differences. Like I said, a 16-year-old is not an adult, but we can all agree that there is a very big difference between a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. You mature and age a lot in that time frame. And so by making Jonas 16, they completely take away the aspect of this book that is a 12-year-old beginning puberty and beginning their journey to adulthood and starting to conquer some of these more complicated emotions and feelings. So I read the book and I thought, oh wait, this isn't really a dystopian, this is a coming of age story. And then I watched the film and I was like, wait a minute, they completely removed the coming of age story and they turned this into a dystopian film. And the movie becomes a lot more about the society and how messed up the society is and how awful all of it is, and how Jonas needs to free these people from the prison that they're living in that they don't even know that they're living in. And it isn't really about Jonas and his emotional journey at all. And that was really disappointing. And so it's all just so interesting to me because when I was a kid, I thought the book was just about how you can't have the good emotions without the bad. And so then I watched the film, and when it spread that message and it spread just the importance of the beauty of the range of human emotion, even if that means that sometimes we feel that suffering, I at the time thought the movie did a really, really good job representing the book. And then I reread the book as an adult and I realized that it's not really a dystopian, it's a coming of age story. And so then when I watched the film, I was like, wait a minute, no, this isn't representative of what the book was supposed to be. They completely changed it. So that was disappointing. Although I will say Meryl Streep and Jeff Bridges both give incredible performances, and I do still think the film is good. I think it sends a good message. I just don't think it's the same message that the book sent, and so I don't think it's a great adaptation, while I do still think it's a good movie, if that makes sense. And also, Taylor Swift is in this movie, but for like 2.5 seconds. And it just brought back all these memories of that being a thing at the time. Like, I completely forgot that aspect of this movie, but Taylor Swift plays Rosemary, and so she only ever appears as a hologram, and also you can see her back like walking away in almost a memory of The Givers at one point. But this movie was very much marketed as having Taylor Swift in it, and I completely forgot about that. Taylor Swift is incredibly famous now, and she was incredibly famous at the time, and I remember part of the controversy of it being that they very much marketed it as a movie with Taylor Swift in it, and she was barely in it. It was kind of like how they very much marketed Dune Part 1 as being a film that had Zendaya in it, and she was in a lot of the trailer, and she did a whole press tour for it, and then she's in a sum total of like a minute of that film, and she doesn't really come into play as a more pivotal character until Dune Part 2. Very similarly, I remember Taylor Swift being a heavy part of the marketing of this film, and then she was basically barely in it. But I will say, she does a great acting performance, and she sings a little bit just in passing, and it's kind of nice to listen to. I certainly think it's better than other acting roles that she's had that I'm sure she wants us to forget about. All of that to say, those are my thoughts on the book. Those are my thoughts on the film. Have you guys read the book? Have you watched the movie? What did you think? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure you subscribe and check out my Patreon. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.